Okay, so we're going to go ahead and go through the next few sections here for our CCP bio class. Um, and both of these sections kind of go hand in hand. They really go together. So I figured, let's talk about the nutrient cycling first, right? Because why do nutrients need to cycle within an ecosystem? Why is this important? I mean, why are nutrients really important in the first place? And the simple answer is, can a plant grow without fertilizer? Even if you grow a plant in pure water, like for example, you buy flowers from a store, you cut the stem, and then they give you this little packet of nutrients you have to put in there in order to maintain the flower growing for a while. And so they make the base of the food chain, so those nutrients get passed right on up the food chain, and they are a vital part of our food chain. Not only are we getting energy in the terms of carbohydrates and proteins for cell structure, we're getting vital nutrients such as minerals that our body needs for things like metabolism, to make DNA, all kinds of other important life functions. So, we need these nutrients to one, be passed through the food chain, but when they get through the food chain, how do we get them back through? Because there's a finite amount of nutrients in an ecosystem. So, really, whenever we look at energy flow, just starting with that, energy comes from, all right, the sun, right? The sun is the ultimate source of energy on the planet Earth. Yes, there are a few other examples, like there's geothermal energy and such, but when we talk about life in general, we do have chemosynthesis, but most of it on the planet comes from photosynthesis, which is the absorption of sunlight, and then we pass that from the bottom on up. And so that brings us to these biochemical cycles. All right, so even the food webs and food chains, they really are also a cycle. We tend not to think of them that way. We tend to think of it as a chain or a straight line, but really it is a cycle. So cycles of chemical elements move through ecosystems. This includes biological organisms and processes and geological abiotic systems and processes. In other words, there's living and non-living processes that go into this whole process and cycle these nutrients through. The big ones we're going to look at are water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. All right, so the first one's water cycle, and we learn this from being small, even from as small children. Very basic cycle. We have water, it evaporates, the evaporation condensates, forms clouds, and then it precipitates, rain, sleet, snow. All right, that's the basic one. Now, it is more complex than that. All right, plants absorb water. Well, they actually give off water through transpiration. One of the neat things when we fly into Costa Rica is we can actually see clouds forming out of the trees. Like you see these clouds look like they're just growing out of the trees. What's from all that transpiration? And then we have, so they call that transpiration. We do have evaporation. And then we do have condensation, and then we have precipitation, but water doesn't just go into a lake and then flow into a river and then flow into the ocean. A lot of it goes through what's called percolation, where it seeps through the soil. Actually, it's purified, and we get groundwater. All living things depend on water. Why do we depend on water? Well, because our body is made up of a majority of water. Down here it's stating 60%. I've seen estimates as high as 70%. Actually, we are made of less water as we age. But the sunlight is providing that energy for that water to move through. You need that energy to cause the evaporation. Then that condensation is the cooling of the water, the collecting of it, and then the precipitation is it dropping back down. But that groundwater is vitally important, okay? And that's because a good majority of water comes from groundwater in the United States. Not a majority, but a good chunk of it. So groundwater consists of two layers, an upper and a lower layer. Upper aquifer is unconfined. In other words, this is where we get our wells, right? So water goes down and it gets this clay, which is semi to non-permeable, and so water is just hanging out on top of this clay. And we can drill down and get a well. The problem with this is if you have pollutants over here, this unconfined aquifer is going to get those pollutants, and it's going to be a problem, and it can contaminate your well. Now, sometimes water finds a way around, gets down into this deeper layer, which is a more permanent thing. And this is a confined aquifer. We had to drill much deeper to get to these confined aquifers. And we can tap these. Matter of fact, Canton, I know, uses a confined aquifer, and that's where they get most of their water. And so down here, it said somewhere, I believe, it says groundwater represents 95% of the fresh water in the U.S., supplying 50% of the population with drinking water. A good majority of northern Ohio gets their drinking water really from a treatment plant that treats it out of the lake. And a lot of times, a lot of people do have like reservoirs or something. We have like the Ladue Reservoir that collects water, and that provides a lot of drinking water for people. But other areas, like I mentioned, Canton gets theirs from a large aquifer that's confined. The nice thing about it is it does any pollution tends to have a difficulty getting down and contaminating this confined aquifer. Doesn't mean it can't happen. It just has that layer of clay that kind of blocks it out. And then there's issues with how fast are you draining this aquifer, because again, if water is, if this is a sealed system, how's water getting in there, right? It's going to take a long time to fill up. So you got to kind of watch how you're using those confined aquifers. But they can be a very beneficial thing. All right, so carbon cycle. And carbon cycle really is a type of energy cycle, because we're looking at carbohydrates. And where do we get carbohydrates from? Technically, we can get it from animals, and although it wasn't directly carbohydrates, we typically get carbohydrates from plants, right? So if we eat plants, we get carbohydrates. Now, how do we get it if we eat an animal? Well, we're not getting carbohydrates, we're getting proteins, but what happened is that animal converted some of the carbon that was in the carbohydrates into amino acids, which then we're getting the carbon that way. And there's actually steps within there too. Like, for example, we can also get proteins from plants as well, and they contain some of that carbon. But basically, making it simple, just think of just the carbon atoms rather than the carbohydrates, right? So we have carbon in the atmosphere. Plants absorb that carbon through photosynthesis. Animals eat the plants, or we eat the animals that ate the plants, either or. And then we get that carbon. How do we return it? Well, when we're digesting these carbohydrates or other carbon-containing compounds, as we digest them, we are going to release carbon in terms of carbon dioxide, and that returns it to the air. Now, sometimes plants and animals die; they get buried deep in the ground, and we can end up getting fossil fuels, which is part of the issue right now. Is that we had a time called the Carboniferous, when the world was really, really hot because there was a lot of carbon in the air. And so there were a lot of swamps because there was a lot of carbon available for a lot of plants. They had a lot of plant life, and then things just died and rotted really slowly. So the slow rotting process caused a lot of those plants to form the coal and fossil fuels that we have today, while we're returning that carbon back to the air much more rapidly than it was initially released, I might add. And so that's what's causing some of the problems that we have today. All right. Now, one thing that we need to look at when we look at like the carbon cycle, how do we cycle these nutrients back around? How do we send them, back into the air? Well, we breathe out carbon dioxide, but there are other ways. Things that decompose us can release that carbon back into the air. It's even more important when we look at things like, for example, nitrogen. The air is made up of 78% nitrogen. Now, we need nitrogen for proteins, right? Well, just breathe in some nitrogen, right? Well, you can't, because nitrogen is triple bonded, and it's just too strong of a chemical bond for us to be able to break down. So we need to get the nitrogen in the form of ammonia and nitrates, although not really ammonia. It's technically not ammonia. It's what we call, when you combine ammonia with a carboxyl group, you get what's called an amino acid. So it's actually an amine group. And the nitrates, technically, we aren't getting either because the plants are using the nitrates. So when lightning strikes, nitrogen breaks down and becomes nitrates, which the plants can absorb and make into um, amine groups, which they can use to make proteins. Now, how often is lightning striking? Not that often, so that's actually a really slow process. There's a group of plants called legumes, which have bacteria that are really good at this. So bacteria actually are the primary um, users of nitrogen in the air, and they're the ones that primarily put nitrogen into the food chain. So legumes are plants that have little bumps in their roots, and they contain this nitrogen fixing bacteria. And they can take that triple bonded nitrogen and turn it into nitrates and nitrites and ammonia. And the plants can then use that to make proteins. Now, an animal eats the plants to get their proteins. Plants are not rich in proteins, legumes are higher. Animals have to eat a variety of plants because we need a complete protein, because understand there are different groups of amino acids, and they come from different groups of plants. And so this is why a lot of herbivores have to have a varied diet, and they then produce the proteins. Now, we eat the animals to get that nitrogen. How do we return the nitrogen back to the plants? Well, when we defecate, poop, or urinate, pee, and basically we make fertilizer. Same thing with the animals. The other thing is just by dying. When we die, we decompose, and bacteria return that nitrogen to the soil. Now, there are some types of bacteria, particularly like in swamps. Remember I said things rot slowly because there's not as much oxygen in swamps. When you have too much living matter, basically it's rotting, you end up choking out all the oxygen. So those things that are rotting really slowly are being digested by a lot of bacteria that are anaerobic, and they actually will use oxygen, but they use oxygen in the form of nitrates, so this NO3, and they take those oxygen molecules and release the nitrogen back into the air. So that is one way that nitrogen gets back into the air, and that's called denitrification. There's a similar cycle called the phosphate cycle. So phosphates are important for plants to grow. Nitrogen and phosphates are two of the main things that we look at when we look at fertilizer content. How much nitrogen and phosphate are in the soil or water. Phosphates are used for things like detergents, by the way, which is one of the ways that we're throwing these systems off. I mean, first of all, fertilizers on land end up getting washed out to like creeks, rivers, streams, and then they flow into lakes and ponds, and that can cause some problems. But phosphates also are found in detergents, and where do detergents ultimately go? Down the drain and then into the water system. And so that's part of the fertilizer for plants. Now, how are we getting the phosphates? We eat the plants. How do we return it? Well, we return it through defecation, poop, pee, or dying. And then we have to be decomposed. Decomposition is an important concept here. This is the way that the nutrients recycle. If you didn't have decomposers, how would you get the materials back into the soil? I mean, really, you wouldn't. By the way, phosphates are found naturally in the soil. That's a major difference between it and the nitrogen cycle. It is that phosphorus is a mineral, and we do not see it in the air. So it's never released into the air. We need it for a lot of things: nucleic acids, cell membranes, ATP, which is how we transport energy in our bodies. Now, remember I said that all of these things are cycles, including food chains, because sunlight hits the primary producers produce energy. You have your herbivores, so it's second trophic level, primary consumers. Then you have your primary carnivores or secondary consumers, then your tertiary consumers. And then how are these all getting those nutrients back? Well, again, it has to be these decomposers. If we don't have decomposers, nothing returns back to the plants and we can't start the process all over again. So in that manner, food chains, yes, it is a food chain, but it does cycle, because then we get all the tritivores, or another fancy name for decomposers. They return all those nutrients back to the soil, which then gets it back to the plants, and then re-enters the food chain. So we cannot have nutrient cycling without these very important decomposers. All right. So decomposition, breakdown of organic matter. It also releases carbon dioxide back into the air. Another way that can occur. Primary producers are dependent on a decomposition of organic matter in order for nutrients to become available. So primary producers are plants and algae, and cyanobacteria, which are blue-green algae. It's not an algae at all. It's a type of bacteria that photosynthesizes. And they all need these nutrients in order for photosynthesis to occur, in order for their life processes to occur. So they need those nutrients returned to them via the decomposers. All right, decomposition rate is strongly affected by temperature, moisture, and chemical composition. I mean, think about it. When are you most likely to get infected with a fungus, and really where? You might say, well, what do you mean I get infected with a fungus? Well, when humans get fungus, where do they get them? Most of the time on their feet, or in their groin, right? Places that tend to be covered, where it's going to be warmer, higher body temperature. Your feet get really, really hot frequently. By the way, one of the reasons your feet get so hot is because you have muscles in your feet that are acting as shock absorbers, and they're absorbing all this pressure because you guys walk on your 2 legs rather than 4 legs, like a lot of other animals. And so we have specialized muscles that act as shock absorbers. They're absorbing all that energy and releasing a ton of heat. So you have a lot of heat. If you have socks and shoes on, then you have a lot of moisture surrounding it, because you're gathering all that sweat. When you have heat in the body, you have sweat. And so all of that makes it a very favorable environment for fungus to grow. And fungi are one of our decomposers. Same thing like with the groin, and this is why jock itch is a thing, right? And so just think about like different ecosystems, all right? So like, are things going to rot quickly in the tundra? Well, no. Matter of fact, I remember seeing something a long time ago when I was a kid, where they were talking about like there was some decomposing seal that they found in I think it was Antarctica, and it was like either 10,000 or 25,000 years old, and it was hardly rotted at all. Again, temperature is a big thing. This is why we keep stuff in refrigerators and freezers, because they lower the temperature. Also, with lower temperature, you have lower humidity. Whereas rainforests are known for things rotting exceptionally fast, very hot, very humid, lots of energy, and so they can cycle those nutrients really fast. Matter of fact, soils of rainforests, paradoxically, have very little nutrients in them. And you might say, well, I thought things rotted really fast. I thought they were returning nutrients to soil. Well, yes, but things are also growing really fast because there's so many nutrients. There's a lot of nutrients in rainforests. They just cycle through really, really fast. Like the moment they're decomposed, they're being absorbed by something that's growing. So temperature and decomposition rate all are things that affect the rate of nutrient cycling in terms of decomposition rate. And so basically, plants and animals, think of them as reservoirs for these nutrients. Like they're storing them until they decompose in order to basically return them back to the soil and recycle them. So we started to talk about the next section a little bit already, really, with discussing the difference between a tropical rainforest and like a tundra. Which one has more living things in it? Well, obviously the tropical rainforest, right? We don't see as many living things in a tundra. Why? Why is that? What's the driving force that makes? What are some of the factors that make ecosystems the ecosystem they are? I mean, so you have the organisms, right? But a lot of times the amount of organisms vary with the ecosystem, and the abiotic environment. So what are some abiotic things that cause an ecosystem to be different, one ecosystem to be different from another? first one's water. Water is really important. I mean, that can be the difference between being a desert and a rainforest. You can be at the same latitude, and you can even be at the same elevation. But if one gets one area gets a bunch of water and another one gets absolutely no water at all, then one's can be support a forest or even a rainforest, and another one, even though all the rest of the conditions are pretty much so the same, if there's no water there, it's going to be a desert. And there's different things that can impact that. I mean, it can be like the what's called the rain shadow effect, where you have a mountain, and in order to get to the air that's carrying all the moisture goes up the mountain, and as it goes up the mountain, it cools, and when it cools, it drops that moisture, and then when it comes back down the mountain, it warms back up, but all the moisture is gone out of it, and so there's no rain on the other side of the mountain. So that's a good example of where you can have two what would normally be similar environments, but because of the amount of moisture, it changes it. The other thing is the amount of available energy to begin with, which is really driven by sunlight. The more sunlight you have, the more plants, the more living animals that you can support. And if you take an acre of land in Ohio and just go out into a forest where you're going to expect to see a bunch of plants, you might see 10, 25, maybe even if you're really, really looking, you might see maybe 50 different plant species at most. Go to an area in Costa Rica and you take that same acre of land, and really, if you see only 100 different plant species in that same size area, you've really, I mean, 100's easy. You're probably going to find 1,000 different plant species in 1 acre of land, if not more. And Costa Rica, by far and away, is not the most diverse. I mean, it is very diverse, but it's not the most diverse ecosystems on the planet. When we start looking at like Amazon and such, we start seeing even more of them. And a lot of that's due to the amount of sunlight creating more plants growing faster, gives more opportunities for evolution. And so therefore you have more diversity. More diversity means more specialization of organisms, more coevolution. So now you have more animals. And it's just kind of this thing where in the rainforest you have a bunch of nutrients. And if you remember, I just said you don't have very many nutrients in the soil, but you do have a lot of nutrients. Where are the nutrients located? In the reservoir pools. And what were the pools? The plants and the animals. So you do have a lot of nutrients available. It's just cycling through really, really fast. Okay, so sunlight and rain are our two biggest indicators. Yes, you need to have the other nutrients too. And they do go a long ways to making a big difference in an ecosystem, but the two primary ones really are going to be your sunlight and your rain. So energy is an open system in terms of energy. We constantly are having energy come from the sun. Energy is never really recycled. We talk about carbon recycling, but that's really more of the atoms. All right, organisms cannot convert heat to other forms of energy. Basically, we're always releasing heat. So we absorb energy, we release some of it as heat, and that energy is wasted. So consumers are known as heterotrophs. They eat things and they get it through a chemical bond type of energy, whereas primary producers are autotrophs. They make their own energy and they get their energy from light energy. Know the difference between the terms herbivores, they eat only plants, carnivores, they eat only animals, detritivores, things that are basically, it's another fancy word for decomposer, and then omnivores, things that eat either plants or animals. All right, and again, we looked at this chart once before, so energy comes in, goes up the food chain, now the carbon, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, they recycle versus the detritivores, but as we go up, notice this arrow gets smaller because a lot of the energy is being wasted because animals are doing what they do through their life. And so really only 10% of the energy goes up each step of the food chain. And so a lot of that energy is, again, kind of just wasted, and that tells us something about these number of organisms. We need to have the most primary producers and the fewest organisms at the fourth trophic level, which are tertiary consumers, also known as secondary carnivores. Here's a breakdown of this beetle's eating a plant. 17% of the energy goes through growth, 33% is wasted via cellular respiration, and then 50% of energy is going to be recycled. 50% of the materials can be recycled via feces. Now, again, energy is going to come in, go to the primary producers, to the herbivores, carnivores, and secondary carnivores. These things are all going to die and produce feces. We have some chemical bonds that recycles the nutrients, but not the energy. 99% of the solar energy is absorbed for heat, so really only 1% of the energy we get from the sun is actually going into the food chain, which is just crazy that there's this abundant amount of energy that we're getting from the sun, and only 1% of it makes it into the food chain. And a lot of that energy is being released as heat. So, as a general rule, 90% of energy is lost in each step of the food chain. So productivity is the rate at which organisms in a trophic level collectively synthesize new organic matter or body tissue. So we want to measure, how much energy, how quickly are organisms able to produce energy. It can be measured for a trophic level or an entire ecosystem. We can look at the whole ecosystem. For trophic levels, the data is displayed in pyramids. So here we look, and then here's the base of our trophic level. Here we have all of these producers. This is photosynthetic plankton. And here's how many kilocalories is what we typically call a calorie that they're producing per year. And notice that it's a very small percentage of that goes into the herbivores and the first level carnivores. And notice it again kind of follows that 10% rule. It's not quite the same, but gives you kind of the general idea. All right, here we see here's a pyramid of biomass. So back here, this is energy flow. This is biomass. How much living matter is there? Your carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and such. And again, we can see a similar trend with the amount of living organisms. So this is a measurement. Basically what you do is you take an area and you would dry it out, and anything that's left over, that's what you consider biomass. And so we see here it's 807 grams per meter for this photosynthetic plankton, and herbivore it's 37 grams per meter. And we don't lose quite as much when we're going to the carnivore here. But again, we see this kind of like energy pyramid type thing. Ecological pyramids demonstrate the level of the relationship of trophic levels. These are the number of organisms we see at each trophic level. So one carnivore has to be supported by 4 billion photosynthetic plankton throughout its lifetime. This one carnivore is going to need 11 herbivores. And you might say, well, what is this carnivore? This carnivore is probably just like a small fish low on the food chain. So when you start eating fish that are really high up on the food chain, like tuna and such, imagine how much plankton is going into that guy. We're talking like pentillions probably. So how do we measure how productive an ecosystem is? Well, first measurement we use is net primary productivity. Represents the organic matter available for herbivores to use as food. So this is, again, kind of like biomass, but a little bit different. And it's how much is being produced per square meter per year. So this is like, you dry out the square meter and just measure the organic matter. And which ones do we see the most energy in? Well, algal beds and reefs. Like it's made up of a lot of producers, so they're producing a lot of energy, and it kind of makes sense. I mean, tropical rainforests, full of plant matter. So again, this really makes sense. We get down here on the low end, and we're looking at these different types of deserts. Not much water, therefore not many plants. Not many plants, not much in terms of the dry plant matter, and then you don't have the rest of the food chain because you don't have many plants. And so we see everything in between here. But notice that things that produce a lot of plants are really high on this net primary productivity. So now let's compare this in terms of net primary productivity per unit area. All right, so what we have here is this is the measurement per area, right? Here's the overall productivity on the planet. So we look at this and notice that algal beds produce a ton of energy. But overall on the planet, they aren't producing a whole lot. Why is that? Well, because we don't have a lot of algal beds and reefs. Like, really, how much of the planet is made up of reefs? Barely anything. Now we look at open ocean, and really just open ocean, like there's nowhere, right? So there's not many plants there. Some photosynthesizers, but really not a lot of plants. Now, we compare that, though, over here, and we look at it, and why is it producing so much? Well, there is most of the planet, about 70%, is open ocean. So because there's so much open ocean, yes, as a whole, it produces a lot. Tropical rainforests, they produce a lot of energy, and they make up a decent amount of our land mass. Not a ton, but a good chunk compared to a lot of these other things. And so because they have a decent land mass and they produce a lot of energy, like they're second on a producer, that's why they're really high up there. Now, what's happening as we're deforesting tropical rainforests? Obviously, this is going down. This isn't going to be affected as much because this is how much they produce per meter. But this has a great potential for impact as a result of deforestation. All right. So what limits the primary production in these areas? And again, it's just this theme we were talking about that we kind of started out the lesson. The amount of plant matter. And the amount of plant matter depends on two major things: sunlight and water. How much water are they getting and how much sunlight? And so where do we see the highest amount of primary production? Well, where we see the most sunlight, and this is tropical rainforest. All right, now why don't we see it right here as much? Well, because there's actually a mountain range right here that kind of gets in the way of things. And then we're just moving north and south, and so now we're getting into the grasslands, which means we're getting less rain. We get the most rain at the equator, and as we move north, we get less rain, therefore we transition to grasslands and the primary production goes down. And as you move further north, you get deserts right here and here where it's really dark in color. Now you might say, well, what the heck's the deal with the U.S.? Because we go across here and there's a desert there, but there's not one here. Well, it's because we got this Gulf of Mexico, and also, so a lot of the way the wind currents are going, it carries a lot of that moisture up into this area. All right, we do have deserts over here, but why do we have deserts over here? Because of a mountain getting in the way. Same thing here, we have a desert going this length right here because of these mountains. The wind's actually moving this way, carrying the moisture, but then it gets blocked by these mountains there. So mountain ranges can really mess with where we see precipitation. But generally speaking, notice we transition back to grasslands, we transition back to forests, and then up here we don't have a lot growing. Why don't we have a lot growing up here? Well, because of it being basically a tundra type biome, a very short growing season, and then again, not much sunlight. All right, here we have a desert. Why is there a desert here? Again, because of a mountain range. Okay, so again, the United States kind of has a little bit of a wonky type of pattern here because of the mountain ranges we have going through here, the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevadas and such. But this is the pattern of species richness. Where do we see the most organisms? And notice that we got something kind of weird going on here, where that's because this is less species richness because of picking up moisture and such, and where the wind and weather patterns go. But notice that more or less up here we have less species, and as we go down here we get more and more and more, and then down here we're getting extreme levels of species by the time we're looking at like Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Costa Rica and Panama. Down here in these countries we're getting just unbelievable levels of species richness because of both sunlight and moisture. So algal beds and kelp forests, keep in mind, there's a lot of variability within these. They produce a lot of energy, um, and it's because of a lot of nutrient availability. Usually, either nitrogen or phosphorus are limiting the amount of growing organisms. That's one of the important things that determines whether an ecosystem is going to be producing enough plants. I mean, yes, you have to have your sunlight and you have to have your moisture. But let's take a water ecosystem, for example. And you can have a lake and you can have two lakes in the same area. And there can be very big differences in the amount of life that you see and what they look like. So, which of these two lakes do you think has the most life? Well, we have an oligotrophic lake and a eutrophic lake. Which one has the most living things? Well, obviously, we see living things in this eutrophic, and we don't see anything living in the oligotrophic. Which one has the most animals in it? Okay, so the oligotrophic lake, that's this one up here. Oligotrophic lakes are characterized by very few nutrients. So since there's so few nutrients, we have basically no plants, and you can see pretty deep into the water. You can see it's crystal clear water. And because we have no plants, we have no food chain, and because we have no food chain, we don't have any fish. There are not any fish in this pond, really. Very few. High levels of oxygen. There's lots of dissolved oxygen in that lake, but there's no plants to support life. There's no producers, just because the nutrients are really low. Now, this lake has gone to the exact opposite end. It has a ton of nutrients. There's so many nutrients in there that the plants are just overgrowing anything. So, how did you answer the question? Which one has more living animals? It was a trick question. There's really neither of these are going to have very many living animals. You might say, well, how the heck is there no living animals in this eutrophic lake? There's plenty of plants. Well, it's actually gone overboard. Remember, ecosystems have to work on a balance. We actually need what's called a mesotrophic lake, where you have a decent amount of nutrients, you have quite a few plants, and those plants then support fish, and then the fish, again, support the whole ecosystem. But in this one, there's so many plants that they're just crowding out everything. And when they die and rot, there's a lot of dying and rotting going on. And so it's actually choking out, it's using up all the oxygen that's in the water. And fish need oxygen. And so we have very few animals in what's known as a eutrophic lake. If you see a lake that's completely covered with algae, that basically just looks like a green pond, a green swamp. And if you remember, I said swamps are low in oxygen. Yeah, you're not going to have very many fish because there's just not the oxygen there because stuff is rotting. And this is actually one of the issues we've been having with Lake Erie, because Lake Erie's been having a lot of nutrient runoff every year. And so we've been having these really severe algal blooms. And when they start to rot, they start to suffocate. Even though they're producing oxygen, more oxygen is being used by the decomposers than the plants can produce, and it actually starts to choke out everything that's living in the lake. And by the way, when you start choking out fish, they also add to the rotting, and so it's just this endless cycle. So remember, ecosystems tend to be in balance. By the way, oligotrophic tend to be young lakes, and eutrophic tend to be very old lakes. Oligotrophic tend to be deep, eutrophic tend to be shallow. Now, again, because of human intervention, and you can have a lot of runoff flowing into a pond or a lake, making it eutrophic, you can throw this off. But generally, that's what we see. All right. So, although open oceans are considered to have low net productivity, there's a lot of variability on that. I mean, what's going to be driving this variability? Well, first of all, latitude, the amount of sunlight. And second of all, how close are they to the lands? If they're near land, they're going to be... Now, that's the difference, though. Open ocean versus, the shores. The shores, we see a lot of nutrients coming off the land, and therefore we have a lot of productivity. But now if we have an ocean current coming around, kind of going like this, and notice it's grabbing all these nutrients that are near the land and dragging them out, and now we're going to have some variability and have a lot more productivity, especially like in this area here. Same thing right there. So, if we have a way to get those nutrients available, then we're going to have more of the more productivity. Another thing that actually happens. So I was drawing like a circle like this because this is the way the ocean currents go. All right, in this half, and then they go this way up here. Okay. Now, the other thing that happens though is that we can have cool water and then warm water. And so what happens is the cool water sinks to the bottom of the ocean, grabs all those nutrients, and then as it gets towards the equator, it starts to basically, this cooler water starts warming up and starts to rise, bringing those nutrients to the surface. And so this cold water has been dragging across the floor of the ocean, and then it's grabbing all these nutrients, gets warmed up, comes up. So we have this upwelling, and now we have more nutrients brought up. And this is one of the important things that bring nutrients to the open ocean. Now, what happens if this temperature becomes closer to this temperature? Well, we aren't going to have that, sinking water, rising water to nearly the same degree. And this is something we've been noticing as the ocean temperatures are starting to even out. We're having less of this upwelling carrying nutrients from along the Arctic all the way up through to the equator, and then having those nutrients rise up. We aren't having the upwelling nearly as much and to the same degree. So anyway, you can see how just with a couple things here and there, we can make some big changes to ecosystems just based on impacting the cycles that we had studied in the previous PowerPoint. So again, you can see how both of them kind of go together there. All right, thank you and have a nice day.